Okay, the webinar has started. Olipa, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone that has joined us. Today, we just want to say that we are grateful to have a very amazing woman to give us a talk on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. However, before we go to our speaker for today, I would like to welcome all our new members and our old, those who are joining us for the first time. Please, you're welcome. I'm looking forward to a very interactive session. Please do not forget to use the chat box, the question and answer box, to type in if you have any questions, any comments, any additions for the presenter today. And so before I go to present to you our today's
Olipa, you're frozen. Oh. Okay.
Sorry about that. Allow me to introduce myself before I proceed to call upon Eva to come and give us a brief introduction about Win for Peace. So my name's Olipa Jere. I'm from Zambia. I'm a Win Zambia member. I'm also a lawyer by profession. I work in the Attorney General's chambers. And I'm also currently a student of International Nuclear Safeguards at Polimi in Italy. For now, before I call upon our presenter, allow me to call upon Eva. Eva, please, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Eva Can, and I'm the leader of the Win for Peace group. Thank you so much for joining our webinar on this very important topic. And I congratulate Olipa for stepping forward to moderate this session. I encourage all other Win for Peace members to do the same. I think it's a great learning experience to learn public presentation skills. So thank you very much, Olipa. Before we hand over to our distinguished speaker, Ms. Deepti Chobe, I would like to give us a brief overview about who we are and what we do. So this is the Win for Peace group within the Win Global Group of Expertise. Our group was founded at the beginning of 2023 because we strongly believe that we need more women to get involved in the areas of nuclear non-proliferation, safeguards, export controls, and disarmament in order to foster world peace. What we do in our group, we conduct coordinated activities across these 4 domains that I mentioned before. In particular, we hold webinars and hybrid events. If ever there is a possibility, of course, we would like to conduct physical events as well. Currently, we have 25 members from 4 continents, and the membership is open to all Win Global members, and I'm the current leader. Here you see photos of our members. You see we are a very diverse community of members. Next page, please. And we have 2 supporters. One is the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation in Vienna. And the other one is the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, and also based at Vienna. We conducted several webinars starting from last year, looking at the foundations of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, safeguards. We looked at Iran's nuclear program, at nuclear export control basics, at the AQ Khan network, at disarmament issues, and about nuclear propulsion, in particular the AUKUS project. And we had quite a large number of participants with 555 and 355 unique viewers. And very important, we have recordings of all our webinars available on our YouTube channel. Just Google Win Global on YouTube and you will find us. Our webinars are open to everyone. and we make announcements on social media, for example, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And if you have participated before, then you will also receive an email whenever there is an upcoming webinar. This year, this is almost our last webinar for this year. We started off with nuclear weapons basics, then we talked about safeguarding SMRs, about the nuclear fuel cycle, cybersecurity, nuclear physics basics, nuclear weapons-free zones, looking at the Pelindaba Treaty and AFCON. Our last webinar was about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and ICANN. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to our moderator, Ms. Olipa Jerry, who will introduce to us the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you. To our dear participants, I would just like to remind you that our webinar, the presenter will give her speech, her presentation for 50 minutes. Thereafter, we'll have 30 minutes to attend to any questions or queries that you, our participants, might have. So please, this is just a gentle reminder to you that if you have any questions regarding the CTBT, please feel free to proceed and type in the questions even during the speaker's presentations. Please feel free to type in or attend to the questions in the last 30 minutes. However, at this juncture, allow me to now introduce one remarkable woman, our today's presenter, Ms. Deepti Chobe, who is part of the executive team of the CTBTO, where she serves as the Director of Knowledge Management and HR since 2021. Her wealth of experience in advancing global security agendas and addressing nuclear and chemical weapons threats includes working with the highest levels of government, achieving transformative change within international organizations, conducting original policy research, and offering media commentary. Chobe is a widely quoted and published expert and speaker on the nuclear test ban, nuclear materials, security, non-proliferation, disarmament, and multilateral regimes. Ladies and gentlemen, we are really in safe hands. I don't know about you, but I can't wait to hear what she has prepared for us. You might also wish to know that she has a long-standing commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and served twice as a chair for the Hague Organization's Diversity and Inclusion events. Ms. Chobe is also a former executive board member for Women in International Security and for the Harvard Women's Leadership Project alumni. At this point in time, ladies and gentlemen, it would take me really an hour to to introduce her and give you her full bio. However, allow me at this point in time to just call upon Ms. Chobe to proceed with her presentation. Thank you so much. Ms. Chobe, please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lipa. I really appreciate that. And Eva, thank you for all the work you've done to bring together what looks like a really remarkable community in terms of the next generation of talent that we need for these truly global, serious, crucial issues. So I feel very honored to have been asked to present information on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the organization. I want to encourage everyone to use this session as a safe space to learn. So please do not be shy if you have questions. Just, as you hear me go through some of the foundational information about the CTBT and our organization, just, feel free to ask your questions or jot them down, and I'll get through as much as we can at the end of this. I'm going to have a presentation to support what we'll be doing today, and then there'll be plenty of time left for questions afterwards. So if you'll just give me a moment, let me share my presentation and get into the right view for that. Okay. And let's see, it says I'm screen sharing. One moment, let me get to, we just did this. There we go. Show presenters view. Forgive me as I make my way through our technology to get this all in order. Okay, here we go. Sorry. go to the beginning. All right, so today I'm going to share with you some basic information about the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. I want to first of all give you an introduction and some of the history about why do we have this treaty that bans all nuclear explosive testing for all time and in all places. I want to talk to you about some of the main provisions of the treaty. Then also how we're organized as an entity that's seeking entry into force of the treaty, and then to tell you what entry into force actually means and about the future of the organization. So first, in terms of the history, let's first talk about, well, why do countries engage in nuclear testing? So we have to cast our memories back to the US conducted a Trinity test in 1945. This was happening while World War II was still happening. And at that time, you have the scientists of the Manhattan Project who have put together these designs for nuclear weapons, but they had to go test to actually understand, do these things work? How do they work? So a lot of testing is about putting in place instrumentation so that you can record data about the kind of nuclear explosion that's happening that further informs the country that's developing nuclear weapons, understanding how the nuclear weapon works, the design works, all the components, et cetera. So we have the Trinity test start in 1945, and then you see rapidly after the conclusion of World War II, we have other states like the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, China coming forward, and they're testing their own devices. So you have the Trinity test was around 20 kilotons. Hiroshima was around 10 to 15, depending on estimates, in Nagasaki. But then you have the largest nuclear test ever done was at 50 megatons, and that was by the Soviet Union, which is the Tsar Bomba test. But the kickoff of this nuclear testing also spurs what we see today as the further development of the nuclear nonproliferation regime, of which the Global Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban is a key part. So what you have shortly after the initial Trinity test and other explosions, you actually have Jawaharlal Nehru, who was Prime Minister of India, who puts forward the first proposal on an international moratorium on nuclear testing. And this was all part of different actions to then ban nuclear tests and to put an end to the nuclear arms race. So we have that happening, and then you start to see even larger nuclear weapons being detonated, and these are what's called thermonuclear weapons, and that kind of adds even more to the tensions of the Cold War. That another key aspect of that happens in 1962, where we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which marked really the height of those tensions between the East and the West, and it was the first major nuclear crisis. We came very close to there being an exchange of nuclear weapons during that time. And because of diplomacy and negotiations, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to take a step back from the brink. And then that also helped with putting in place a partial nuclear test ban treaty that prohibited nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. However, there were no verification measures to the partial test ban treaty. So that was called the PTBT. Then we have the negotiations of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. I'm glad to see Eva gave me an idea of the different lectures you've already had, so I presume you're all well aware of the NPT. And the preamble of the NPT explicitly expresses the desire for a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. So then in the 1970s and 80s, you see further efforts to restrict nuclear testing continue, but it wasn't until the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s that we actually start negotiations for a comprehensive nuclear test ban. So that starts in 1993, and then the treaty was opened for signature in 1996. And then in 1997, the Preparatory Commission was established for further supporting the treaty's entry into force. So on the slide, you see some of these key dates, and let me just switch to the next one. So let's talk about, okay, worldwide nuclear tests. So between 1945 and 2017, there were over 2,000 nuclear explosions at over 60 locations throughout the world. These were atmospheric tests, these were underground tests, these were tests in the oceans. And what that adds up to is one explosion for 9 days, every 9 days for 50 years. And then what you have listed on this slide, it shows you the sheer scale of nuclear testing that's happened by those countries. And by the way, some of these tests, like depending on, there's like a set of counting issues where some of these tests, it's different devices being tested at the same time or different designs. So there's some methodology also around the number of tests and how they're counted. That said, let's talk about, well, what effect did the negotiations and conclusion of a CTBT have on nuclear testing? We all know that correlation doesn't always equal causation, but this statistic is certainly striking that during the period of 1995 to 1996, there were more than 2,000 nuclear explosions. From 1996 to today, there were fewer than a dozen, and by 3 states. And in this century, there has only been 1 state that has tested, and that's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, colloquially known as North Korea. So one other way of looking at the impact of the CTBT is that you can certainly say that there's been a global norm against nuclear testing that has been put in place since the treaty was open for signature. And you can see this, so what you see in the graphic here is the number of tests, and what we show is the opening of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and then later on in the x-axis, you see the CTBT open for signature, and then you see the number of tests drastically reduces. So there we see, okay, that's great. So there is a common understanding amongst most countries in the world, barring one, that nuclear testing is something that needs to end. And by the way, so let me also give you a little bit of context. So why do states test? I gave you one part of that, which is understanding, do these devices work? So there's a reason that you test if you're trying to engage in what's called vertical proliferation. So if you're trying to test more advanced or different designs. There's another reason that one would test, which is if you were a newcomer and you're trying to demonstrate or announce that you're nuclear weapons capable, you would also test, and also to have any assurance that whatever device that you had created has any credibility. So that's called horizontal proliferation. So when we talk about trying to prevent new states from becoming nuclear weapon capable, that's horizontal proliferation. And when we talk about in the context of arms control, trying to bring down number of nuclear weapons overall, but also trying to diminish the types and kinds of them, that's vertical proliferation. Okay, so what's in the treaty? So the key provision is Article 1, and this article sets out the main prohibitions of the treaty, that states parties may not carry out nuclear weapon test explosions or any other nuclear explosions. They may not authorize such explosions on their territory or in areas they control. The article also prohibits states parties from assisting others in carrying out nuclear tests. Each state party also undertakes not to carry out a nuclear weapons test explosion or other nuclear explosion, and to prohibit and prevent any such explosion at any place under its jurisdiction or control. Each state party further undertakes to refrain from causing or encouraging the carrying out or participating in any manner the carrying out of a nuclear weapon test explosion or any other nuclear explosion. So this is a pretty, again, comprehensive ban on nuclear testing. So that's Article 1. The other key provision I want to pull out for you in this treaty is Article 4, which is on verification. And this is important. Sorry, let me advance that. There we go. This is important because recall I mentioned the Partial Test Ban Treaty that was about trying to bring some constraints in place, but there was no verification. So how do we actually know whether people are abiding or governments are abiding by their obligations? So in Article 4 of the CTBT, we actually have a really unique verification regime in place that we have worked on developing over the last 27 years since the treaty opened for signature. So what you have in Article 4 in verification is that we have set up an international monitoring system, and I will talk more about what that is and the technologies that we use for it. We also have provisions for consultation and clarification. So once we have entry into force, if there are questions about, is one state perhaps in violation of its obligations, what are the steps that can be taken to clarify and consult on that? We have also, again, after entry into force, the ability to do on-site inspections. We can talk about that. And then finally, also confidence building measures. So let me share with you a little bit about each of these things. So the international monitoring system, as conceived of in the treaty, is not just the facilities we have around the world that monitor and collect data. It also includes the concept of an international data center that receives in the data from these facilities and then is able to review and do reports about whether an event that has happened is nuclear in nature or not. Consultation and clarifications. This is basically saying to states parties, look, before you escalate to asking for an on-site inspection, every effort should be made to clarify and consult to make sure that there's no understandings about maybe what has been picked up or whether somebody is tested or not. On-site inspections, though, is that a state party may request the inspection for the sole purpose of determining whether a nuclear explosion has occurred in violation of Provision 1 of Article 1. And then confidence building measures, they're set out in the treaty protocol, and they're designed to help resolve any compliance issues arising from possible misinterpretation of verification data related to chemical explosions. So you'll find out when I talk a little bit more about the technologies, one of them is around seismological data. Well, if you have somebody who's conducting a chemical explosion, so that might be something that happens in mining, that's picked up by seismometers, but we need to be able to differentiate between activity like that versus a nuclear test. So what's the status of the treaty today? So one of the things that we are still focused on, and it is a prime priority for the executive secretary, who's Dr. Robert Floyd, and you can see him in this photo addressing the UN General Assembly, is further universalization. So how do we get all the countries that we still require to sign and ratify the treaty? So we're 27 years on as a preparatory commission. And what I can tell you is that I don't believe that the negotiators of the treaty thought that it would take us this long for entry into force. But the designers of the treaty also created one of the highest thresholds for this treaty to enter into force. So we have both Annex 1 and Annex 2 treaties, treaty countries. We require all Annex 2 countries to sign and ratify before the treaty can enter into force, and I will talk about it in a second about who those states are. However, with Dr. Floyd, he has continued the momentum for countries to continue to place value on everything that the CTBT can do for them. And so as of today, we have 187 states that have signed or ratified, and 178 of those have ratified. We've had 9 ratifications in the last 18 months, which has been this other resurgence in particularly Annex 1 states, seeing that this is still important and that they should sign up. So Papua New Guinea was the latest in March of 2024. And then, as I mentioned, for entry into force, we need 44 Annex 2 states to ratify. These Annex 2 states, and I'll just switch to the next slide so you can see them, these were states at the time of the negotiations of the treaty that were determined to have either that they had already some kind of nuclear capability in terms of nuclear power, or that they were suspected to have that. So what we see here is out of the 44, there are now 9 countries that remain to either sign or ratify. There are 3 countries that have neither signed nor ratified. So this is where you can see how hard the bar is for us to get entry into force, because one of those countries is the DPRK. You also have India and Pakistan. They conducted nuclear tests in 1998. They have yet to sign or ratify. Pakistan, however, is an observer to the CTBTO. And that can be a way for countries to better understand what is it that the treaty does, what does the organization then require them to do if they were to sign up for the responsibilities of the treaty. Then we have a set of countries that have signed but not ratified. So so we have China. China has stated that as soon as the United States does it, that they will ratify. You have Egypt has signed but not ratified. Iran signed but not ratified. The same for Israel. And just this year, unfortunately, the Russian Federation had been one of the earliest countries to have ratified the CTBT, and they then asked us to de-ratify them, or actually really asked the UN Secretary General, who's the depository for the treaty, to de-ratify Russian Federation. They've stated that that was then to, put them on an equal footing with the United States. Under President Bill Clinton, there was an attempt to ratify the CTBT with the Senate at the time, and unfortunately, that effort, due to other political factors, failed in the United States. So the U.S. is a signatory, but hasn't been able to get the support necessary in a very divided Senate to be able to get support for ratification of the treaty. So that's the current status. And so as you can see, this is like a really hard thing for us to get these remaining countries on board to ratify. And that's what's required for us to have full entry into force and to be able to have full access to all of the tools that the treaty provides. So despite all of that, we will continue our universalization efforts, and I'm happy to talk about that more if you'd like in the Q&A. Let's see, there are a total of, this here is a map of our international monitoring system. The treaty calls for 337 facilities. Our IMS station, this international monitoring system is the IMS. We use 4 different technologies in order to collect the kind of data that help us verify whether an event is a nuclear explosion. To date, out of a total of 337 facilities, we have 306 which are certified as of today. So even though we haven't had entry into force, the commission is mandated to set up the operations of our verification system as if, to prepare for entry into force. So we have to be able, over the past 2 and nearly 3 decades, it's been the setting up of these technologies, these stations, being able to test it, to maintain them. It's to make sure that data is transmitting. It's making sure once that data comes in, that we know how to analyze it and understand it and share that information with states parties or state signatories now. So I've mentioned there are 4 monitoring technologies. So here what you have is one of the arrays that we would use for collecting seismic related data. So if there's like an earthquake or ground movement. Here on the bottom, this is a hydrophone that looks like it's about to be installed. So this is hydroacoustic technology. This is what allows us to listen under the sea or under the ocean. This is an infrasound array. So this is like sound that travels through the air. And then finally here, this is a radionuclide station. So this is sniffing the atmosphere for radionuclides, which would actually be a telltale indication that, in fact, an explosion was nuclear in nature. So as I mentioned before, these are the 4 technologies. We have 170 seismic facilities in the network, 11 hydroacoustic facilities, 60 infrasound, and 80 radionuclide facilities. Let me just share with you this kind of depiction of the CTBT verification regime. So what you have here is a visual depiction of our international monitoring system that collects data using these 4 technologies. It then transmits through a global communications infrastructure to the International Data Center, which is here in Vienna, which is where we're headquartered. And it's then for the International Data Center to process that data, come up with data products, and to redistribute that information to all states via something called national data centers. The on-site inspection part of our verification regime is the ultimate tool, but it can only be activated after entry into force. And then, as I mentioned before, we also have these other tools around consultation and clarification and confidence building measures. But again, those are tools that we can only use after entry into force. So let me now tell you a little bit about the Preparatory Commission. So this was established in 19th November 1996. We are an international organization. We are part of what's called the UN Common System. We are not like the IAEA, which is a specialized agency of the United Nations, so the International Atomic Energy Agency. Instead, we are what's called a related organization in the UN Common System. So our terms of reference are the treaty. There's a resolution that establishes the commission. The commission has rules of procedure. We have decisions of the commission that they have made over the past 27 years. And then, of course, there's also practice. In terms of our function as a preparatory commission, we are to build up the verification regime. We assist with national implementation measures. So for instance, some of our state signatories, well, they are the ones who host facilities. We want to help them with, for instance, making sure they have in place facilities agreements so they also understand what their rights and responsibilities are. We also facilitate the ratification process, right? Governments aren't necessarily by themselves going to come forward and say, oh, yes, I need to sign and ratify. This is something that the Secretariat and the Commission helps with in terms of making sure that the treaty is seen as relevant and important and that we're able to engage government so that they can take the steps required. We are also required to prepare for what's called CSP1, and CSP stands for Conference of States Parties. That is something that happens after entry into force. And that's when we are right now we are the preparatory commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. After entry into force, we would simply become the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. The other functions of the commission are to supervise the activities of the PTS, which stands for the Provisional Technical Secretariat. So I am an official of the PTS. After entry into force, the PTS becomes a technical secretariat because we're no longer provisional. And then the commission also considers and adopts the draft annual program and budget of the organization. So again, the commission's real mandates are to promote the treaty, they establish the global verification regime, and we prepare for effective CTBT implementation in the first conference of states parties. And here again is a picture of the executive secretary, Dr. Robert Floyd. He took office August 1st, 2021. And again, as I told you, universalization is a huge priority of his in order to make sure that, you know, in a time in the international nuclear order where there's a lot of concerns about the erosion of non-proliferation norms, disarmament norms, one of the things that he talks about is the CTBT is actually one of the few bright spots and shining successes of the different elements of the nuclear non-proliferation disarmament regime. And we have to kind of remember that and protect that. And also, I think, shield and support the CTBT so they can continue to play that role. Let me share with you a little bit about the structure of the commission. So as I said before, there's a preparatory commission. You can think about this as like the gathering of all of the representatives of our state signatories. There are two subsidiary bodies. They're called Working Group A and Working Group B. Working Group A deals with budgetary and administrative matters such as the annual budget, financial, staff regulations, rules, legal issues. Working Group B deals with verification issues. And then we also have an advisory group which advises the commission on financial, budgetary, and associated administrative matters. Both Working Group A and Working Group B can make recommendations to the preparatory commission, and the commission can choose to take up decisions or provide their guidance. And then each state signatory has one seat in the preparatory commission and its subsidiary bodies. I'll also share with you, for those who kind of think about how do these organizations, from a governance perspective work, I will tell you that the Preparatory Commission is still one of the few bodies that operates on consensus basis. So we have not yet had to go to voting for discussion of substantive matters. It really does still work on, you know, they talk about the Vienna spirit, but it still is based on consensus. On the Provisional Technical Secretariat, let me just give you a sense of what the structure of the PTS is. We have the Executive Secretary. There are then 6 of us who serve as directors, and we're members of what he calls the Executive Secretary calls the executive team. So there are directors for all the red boxes that you see in this organogram. The 4 things that you see at the top were all included in the Office of the Executive Secretary. So you have the front cabinet office, you have internal audit and oversight, We have quality manage and performance monitoring. So those are like evaluation aspects of the organization. These people in those sections sit a bit independent from anyone else so that they can advise the executive secretary. Human Resources Services, which is part of my portfolio in the organization. I'm part of the Office of the Executive Secretary. And then we have these 5 other divisions. So we have administration, there's legal and external relations, and then we have our 3 technical divisions. So there's the International Data Center, the International Monitoring System, and the On-Site Inspection Division. In terms, let me talk a little bit about the future of the organization, particularly after entry into force is achieved. So there would be the transformation of the preparatory commission. So after the conclusion of the first session of the Conference of States Parties, and then that CTBTO is meant to utilize the expertise and facilities of the commission. So you would expect that the Provisional Technical Secretariat is doing all of the work up until entry into force, and it will continue to do so because that expertise is meant to be used, and those structures, although maybe structures after entry into force may change. But the first Conference of States Parties needs to be held no later than 30 days after entry into force. And entry into force, it happens 180 days after all Annex II states have ratified. So that still gives some time for the PTS, but there are actually projects afoot that look at, in the long term, what are all the things that the Provisional Technical Secretariat needs to do so that we're ready for entry into force and how the organization would need to operate. So for a future organization known as the CTBTO, the mandate would be to achieve the object and purpose of the treaty. It would be to ensure implementation of all of its provisions and to provide a forum for consultation and cooperation among states parties. And that's one of the most important things I can say about multilateral or treaties like ours is one of the huge benefits of it is that we are providing a forum for states parties at the time to come and bring forward what their issues are and to engage and to resolve, and particularly in terms of upholding the objectives of the treaty. This slide here will show you what happens in terms of the conversion of certain entities from the current state it is now and to what they become after entry into force. So right now it's ratifying states or state signatories, they become states parties. The preparatory commission becomes the Conference of States Parties. Working Group A, Working Group B, the advisory group becomes the Executive Council. The Provisional Technical Secretariat becomes the Technical Secretariat, and then the Executive Secretary becomes the Director General. So one of the analog organizations and treaties that you can look at for understanding this structure is the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's very similar in many ways. So then again, we have these elements of the verification regime after entry into force. I've touched on some of these items. Let me show you this next slide, which is, it shows you the international monitoring system, kind of gathering data. The International Data Center looks at the data, releases products, and then if necessary, after entry into force, there can be the conduct of on-site inspections if there are concerns about a development within a state party. And then it's up to the Conference of States Parties and the Executive Council to draw conclusions and decide. So let's also talk a little bit about what happens after entry into force and some of the other tools that would be available to our states parties. So one is this thing around on-site inspection. So an on-site inspection can clarify whether a nuclear explosion was carried out. You deploy teams of inspectors to gather evidence to identify if there's been a violation. That would only be authorized by an executive council by providing a green light for that. But the final judgment lies with the executive council based on the reports that would be submitted. Although this is something that would only be enforced after the treaty enters into force, we still do exercises called integrated field exercises. There was one in 2008 in Kazakhstan, another one in 2014 in Jordan, and we're currently planning for one in 2025 in Sri Lanka. And that's what informs my colleagues in on-site inspection about their manuals, procedures, practices, technologies, et cetera. So what are the differences between us being a preparatory commission, which is what we are now, versus the CTBTO? So with entry into force, we would have full operation of the verification regime. There would be the possibility of consultation and clarification mechanisms. So especially, I think, to de-escalate any potential conflicts or concerns about violations. There's the possibility of on-site inspections. There are collective measures that can be taken by states parties. This is in Article 5 of the treaty. There's also the possibility of referral to the United Nations, and that's in Article 5. That can be, I think, both to the General Assembly as well as to the UN Security Council. And there's also the opportunity for confidence building measures. There are other things that we do. I've talked about the universalization priority of the executive secretary, but there's actually obligations that are for the existing state signatories in terms of bringing the treaty into force. And one is something that's called the Article 14 Conference. It happens once every 2 years. It promotes entry into force. You have state signatories coming together to see what can they do individually and collectively to persuade those who have yet to sign and ratify to do so. There are ministerial meetings that are part of that, give entry into force high-level attention. You know, we know that for many countries, CTBT and nuclear issues and nonproliferation and disarmament is just one of many competing priorities for governments, and particularly those governments where they may be resource constrained, you know, and they have other priorities they're thinking about, like feeding their people or economic stability or climate change. So how do you still maintain attention so that we can advance this agenda? We also tackle this from the next generation perspective, where who's inheriting this planet? You know, who's inheriting the implications if nuclear testing were to resume? Well, it's the next generation. So how do we make sure that they see this as an issue for them to take up and where they could potentially have influence in some of the countries that still are required to sign and ratify? There's also an International Day Against Nuclear Tests. It just happened on 29th August. And what you see here is a quote from the UN Secretary General, who's also seized of this matter, where he calls on all countries whose ratifications are needed for the treaty to enter into force to do so. And I guess the last thing I will just leave you with, and we can talk about this in the Q&A if you want, is, so does entry into force matter? Looking at all the things that we've already done over the last 27 years, where we have the provisional operations of, you know, a fairly, 90% complete international monitoring system. We have an international data system, a data center that is able to pull in data, process, and push information back out to state signatories. So we surely have a strong international norm, but does it matter if we have a legally binding international instrument? My view is yes, because I think we want the international community to have the full set of tools that are available for ensuring that we truly are putting an end for all time in all places, nuclear explosive testing. So with that, let me just conclude and let me turn off my presentation so that you can also, that we can instead talk face to face. So that's all I have in terms of some of the foundational elements of the CTBT, and then let me hand this back to Olipa for her to moderate. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipti. That was very enlightening. Thank you again. I think we'll take questions first of all before I ask if any of the panelists would have questions. So I'll start with question number 1 from Jerry. What are the consequences of signing the treaty but not implementing it?
Okay.
And the second one,
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, the second one, they seem to be related. The second one is from Sana Jamal. They want to find out the difference between signing and ratifying. Yes.
Great.
So if you can take those 2 questions, then we will see if we have any more questions. Thank you.
Will do. And big kudos to Sana and Jerry for kind of demonstrating that it's great to ask questions and just put them in the chat. So Sana, let me take your question first, which is what's the difference between signing and ratifying? So one way of thinking about this is signing it's the first step you take in fully taking up the responsibilities and obligations of a treaty. Ratifying is usually what's required to take up those responsibilities within your domestic political process. So it's what actually obligates you. There is also the Vienna Convention that states that even with just signature, you are not to do anything that would contravene the object and purpose of the treaty, but that's not the same thing as fully implementing your obligations, which is what's required under ratification. So that's the difference. So signature is first, and then you have to ratify. So signature is first step, ratification is second step. So that's why we need everybody to sign and ratify. Second question from Jerry about the consequences of signing the treaty but not implementing it. Well, I think we have to talk about what does that mean by not implementing it. So there are a whole array of states where they need to sign and ratify. But there's maybe not that much more left for them to do aside from what they choose to do, which is maybe to set up a national data center to pull in for themselves and maybe analyze data about events, or to maybe even make use of some of the civilian and scientific benefits of our data and technology. For instance, we have countries that have also signed up for tsunami warning treaties or tsunami warning agreements with us. That's up to them. So for them not to do that, there's no consequence. But if we start talking about not implementing it, meaning that you've signed or ratified and you start conducting a nuclear explosive test, that's going to be problematic. You're in violation of the treaty. So there are issues about what do we do in this time where the treaty has not entered into force, and to have a state signatory violate the object and purpose of the treaty would be really problematic. So I imagine that would be something that would be really hard for the commission in its current form to be able to take up. But I imagine something like that happening would certainly be seized by other international mechanisms like the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council. So that's one of the reasons we actually need to get entry into force, because then there's a full set of tools for dealing with that. Okay, I see some other questions. One from Mercy is, once the CTBT enters into force, will the CTBTO's role in conducting on-site inspections conflict with the IAEA's Safeguard Department's responsibilities? And there the answer is no. So what the International Atomic Energy Agency Safeguards is doing is they're trying to ensure that nuclear material that is produced by a state that has safeguards in place is not diverted to nuclear weapons development. So that may be them going to a nuclear power plant or an enrichment facility to be able to determine that. That's not what CTBTO does. Our on-site inspectors, we don't have a standing inspectorate, unlike the agency, and also unlike the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, where they also send out inspectors to make sure chemical weapons aren't being developed. CTBTO, we deploy once there's been a concern received by a state party that they believe that a nuclear explosion has taken place. So they get deployed on site to then, do everything from taking samples of the soil, the atmosphere, conducting surveillance of the site, the suspected search area, and to be able to develop their report and recommendations back to the Executive Council. Okay. Olipa, did you want to go through the other questions or?
Yes, please. There's one from Benedetta. She's saying there's only 187 states that have signed the treaty. What about the remaining UN member states?
Yeah, so you will see that all of the states that we have left, which are 9, that have signed the treaty is actually less than that. There's only 3 that have not signed it. That's India, Pakistan, and North Korea. All the remaining 6 countries that have actually signed it, that's, Egypt, Iran, the United States, China, Russian Federation, Israel. These are all UN member states. So this is where we need, everybody coming on board. We're like really close to universalization, but it's a tough bar for some of these other countries. So you have North Korea, which is probably one of the hardest, I think, problems to solve, particularly for what they perceive as their threat environment and what's happening in terms of the past several years, where they're not only developing their nuclear weapons capabilities. By the way, they have not tested those since 2017. What they've actually done is started to further demonstrate what they can do with their delivery system. So that's all these missile tests that have been happening and escalating over the last few years. So I think North Korea is probably the toughest one. India and Pakistan, arguably they have their own regional and national calculation. They did conduct tests in 1998. And at the time, they believed that the information they gathered from conducting those tests and the instrumentation that they had in place to receive data, they believed was sufficient. They had also declared themselves to be nuclear weapons capable. Prior to that, since 1968, the Indians had engaged in a policy of strategic ambiguity, where it was thought that they probably had the capabilities to do this, but they hadn't outright declared it. And so 1998 comes, and they were concerns that the CTBT would actually enter into force, or that there would be, kind of strong groundswell for it. And India had concerns about how the CTBT was actually developed in its final form. And so they went to have these nuclear tests, and then Pakistan immediately follows. But there is a set of calculations that likely includes in their regional security about what is China doing. And what's important for us as a provisional technical secretariat is to look at each of these countries in their own context and to see kind of how has their, what is their current thinking? What are the issues that they would need resolved? What are different actors or entities that could prevail on them to see what would be the benefits of taking further steps on a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. And also, I think, raising the concern that indefinite moratorium, which is what's currently in place, aside from DPRK testing, that's maybe not sufficient, that's actually something very fragile to just think that people will refrain from testing when we can, in fact, have more firm commitments to not do that. Okay. There you go.
Thank you. I see there are two more questions. You may allow me to just read them out to you. I think one is a follow-up questions from Jamal. What if a country has signed, but it still threatens to attack a population by nuclear weapons?
Yeah.
Then I'll also take the second one from Mingo. Treats, dear Deputy, thank you for a very concise presentation about CTBTO. What do you think the role of small nations who are not superpowers possessing nuclear weapons in global non-proliferation and ban of nuclear tests worldwide could be? What could be the role of these small nations? Okay. Thank you.
So, Sanaa, you're asking a question, I think that's pretty relevant, where, I think it was widely understood for a long time that nuclear weapons are not ever to be used, right? So they are devastating in their use. We have only to look at even what was used for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the devastating consequences of that, both for human life, the planet, environment, people's sense of peace and security. And I think we're now in a place where over the last, I would say actually, I've been in the nuclear policy space for 20 to 25 years. One of the things that I've seen is this lowering of the threshold of people talking about the usability of nuclear weapons. And how do you separate out what seems to be a political statement from an actual threat that would be implemented to use it? So I think one of the challenges of our current, international organizations, and not just CTBTO, but certainly the broader UN system and the UN General Assembly and the Security Council is that they really struggle, with what do you do with kind of threats to peace and security. And I think our challenge I think that would be an issue that would need to be taken up there. And depending on who the country is that's making that threat, that also further complicates kind of conversation that can happen around it. So I think for all of you, in this moment where we look at the international order, it's challenging, right? Where you have nations that in their own sense of what their self-interest is, they're not abiding necessarily by these bigger global norms about how countries should interact and operate. So I would say that we're right now at a time where it's actually really difficult to address and constrain using international legal norms and tools and processes to address that. So I think that we're in a tough place. But if we had entry into force of the CTBTO, that would give us a different space to be in to address it. And then, Mingle, I see your question, which is about what is the role of small nations who are not superpowers?
I think you have attended to that one. But I have two direct questions from participants. Let me just read them. They were sent directly to Okay, so one is asking about the relevance of Article 43. Why was the CTBT drafted in a way to require those 43 states to sign and ratify the treaty before it can enter into force? That's number one. Can I proceed to the second one?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the second question is, until the treaty enters into force, is there another use for the information extracted from the monitoring stations?
Okay, great. So in terms of those 44 countries that are in Annex 2 at the time, so again, this is in the early 90s, it's after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. I think the thinking amongst technical experts is for you to have assurance that you are capturing the relevant countries that could potentially test a nuclear weapon, you need to look at some proxy capability. And here they were looking at who had potential nuclear power capabilities. So, and otherwise, can you imagine that they didn't have that, so that there was no kind of setting out countries where you're concerned about them, and that you enter into force, but those countries aren't part of the regime. So I think there's one way of thinking about this, which is, what is the value of a CTBT where every country in the world signs and ratifies, but North Korea doesn't? So you have one country that's potentially standing outside and continuing to test. What do you do? Because the treaty doesn't apply to that. So the treaty tools are obviously difficult to use there, but, does it, or do you see potentially some amendment being made about entry into force, as you get closer to an outcome where there's maybe one or only a few countries that have not come on board? So I think that would be the first question first response I would give you about the 44. And believe me, there are treaty negotiators since then who have learned the difficulty of having such a high threshold for entry into force. So you learned in your last session, I saw from Eva's introduction, about the TPNW. The TPNW has quite a low threshold for entry into force. And so that was something that was very easy, relatively speaking, for them to do, and very quickly. They were able to get, I think it was 60 ratifications, and it was an entry to force. Please go check my numbers. The second question, which is, are there other uses for the data that's collected by the International Monitoring System? The answer is yes. And one of the things that I would recommend any of you to do is to take a look at our website, where we've had it happens every 2 years. We have a science and technology conference that's hosted here in Vienna. And it's an opportunity for people in our broader ecosystem of the CTBTO to bring forward their scientific research, where, what have they found making use of this kind of data? What are kind of other ideas on parts of our verification system? And you'll see that the data has been used for things in climate change, So we're able to see how certain researchers are able to use our data to monitor and see what's happening in the oceans. We've been able to use it. I believe there's an article even about how it's been used for tracking whales. And so that's from listening underwater to that. There are, as I mentioned, tsunami warning agreements. So we're able to help people with potential disaster warning for natural disasters. So there's a lot that's out there. And, I'd encourage you to go online and read more about that. And I think that's one of our, something that state signatories, particularly those that may not be immediately concerned about nuclear testing happening in their country or in a neighbor's. They want to know what are the other benefits, potential benefits of the treaty. And I think there has been wide support from our state signatories that there are these peaceful and scientific and civilian uses of the data. By the way, though, I did not answer the question from Mingle, so let me just do that. It was the last one in the chat, which is, what do you think the role of small nations who are not superpowers possessing nuclear weapons in the global non-proliferation and ban of nuclear tests worldwide could be? Well, I think we're already seeing it. I think we see from the executive secretary's efforts to get a lot of those, let's call them small nations, who are Annex 1 countries to sign and ratify. They are actually sending a really important message to the rest of the global community that this treaty matters, their commitments matter, reinforcing the norm matters, and that we need to generate this momentum so that those remaining Annex 2 states also focus their mind and their interests about the benefits of signing and ratifying. So I think these small states are far from being small. I think their voice matters a lot.
Thank you so much, Dipti. I don't see any more questions, but if you may allow me, I have one question for you.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so in light of the emerging threats against nuclear security currently, what are some of the challenges that you foresee that countries or that your organization will face in implementing the CTBT treaty? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of more challenging factors right now is just what's happening more broadly in the international order, right? Where kind of in this post-Cold War, post-bipolar world where you have, I wouldn't even say emerging powers, but you have emerged powers and, trying to create this multipolar world. I think kind of coming to agreement on broad progressive ideas is harder and harder. I think the security calculus is a lot more complex for countries. And then when they're even in a multilateral forum to talk about these issues, to address concerns, if you have kind of entrenched political positions, it makes it all the more difficult. So that's where I think we remember multilateral diplomacy is one aspect of what can support how the international community engages with one another. There's a lot of stuff that happens, though, bilaterally, right? What are the signals that one country is sending the other, right? And we have very little to do with that. So I just think to the extent we're expecting multilateral organizations and fora to resolve these issues, I think it's just becoming harder and harder. It's far from hopeless. I would certainly say that. I think there's so much value in having created mechanisms like international organizations and the potential of binding commitments to shape a world that I think we all want, one where we are keeping human beings safe and the environment safe, and we're protecting the planet, and that we're not recklessly and needlessly building more sophisticated or deadlier nuclear weapons. How many are enough, right? These are questions I think people have asked for a long time. So I would say the primary challenge I see is just what's happening, in the broader kind of international political dynamic amongst countries.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dipti. Do we have any burning questions from our participants? From Eva, any last words?
Well, if you allow me a question, I just have
Okay,
a
sure.
more of a technical question, Deepti. Do you think, I mean, with today's technologies of computer simulation and instrumentation, could we do completely without nuclear testing, or is nuclear testing still needed if if a state wants to develop nuclear weapons?
Right. Thank you, Eva, for that, because I think it allows me to talk about two things. So why is it that we have countries like the United States that conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests? Why have they entered into a moratorium? And why is the US's position that it does not foresee the need for nuclear testing? It's because all of those tests were instrumented in such a way that they have gathered all of the data that they believe they need for their supercomputers to answer the questions they have about the existing arsenal and its reliability. So the question is, so what is the difference between states like the United States that has conducted so many and the Soviet Union, and then there's considerably fewer tests from some of the other declared nuclear weapon states? What does it mean for them to feel that they have comfort in the data they have? Maybe that their tests were not instrumented as well. They don't have the rich data that some of these other, the former superpowers have. So I think for some countries, it is certainly enough. And maybe for a lot of those declared nuclear weapon states, they believe they have sufficient information. I think the question you raise is about, but what happens if you're a newcomer? What happens if you're somebody who is trying to maybe potentially further announce your capabilities? So I think North Korea, for me, falls in that context, right? Where, yes, they're testing in order to see whether their devices and designs work and to what extent, but they're also testing to convey a political message. So they usually take responsibility when they conduct a test. They say, yes, that was us. And that's about power projection, about their nuclear capabilities. If you're another country, though, that is thinking about, becoming a nuclear capable state, at some point you're eventually going to need to test. One is to know that your devices work and to lend credibility to it, and to, I think, just declare yourself. It's possible that you could do it, obviously, in secret, hoping that there isn't detection. But again, I think it connects to what are the political and security goals of that country. So I just think that these and the different kinds of countries we would put into, so you have the US and the Russian Federation in one category, you have potential newcomers in another, you'd have to take a look at what is their technological capacity. But you have triggered for me another thing that I would raise about kind of the future landscape of CTBTO. I think, like many organizations, we need to contend with changes that are happening technologically, right? What does machine learning mean for how we take in so much data and information? And what do we ask human analysts to do when they look at it to confirm that an event happening is not nuclear in nature, or to make their assessment? What do we do in terms of using those kinds of potential efficiencies, but also being mindful of bias in the use of machine learning or artificial intelligence? I think about that for some of the operations in my part of the organization, where we're trying to do human resources modernization using enterprise resource planning systems. And we have vendors who say that they want to use artificial intelligence to help us with some of our recruitment practices. Well, I'm a little bit concerned about how that really works. What is feeding their, whatever their AI functionalities are, because I have a responsibility to make sure we're not introducing or amplifying bias in our recruitment processes, because we also want a very diverse and inclusive secretariat staff. So I think there's a lot that's happening in the broader UN system to try to grapple with, what does the 21st century workforce look like across the range of missions in the UN Common System? How do we understand what technology means for that? So I see it in the operations of the PTS, but I can also see it for, not just what we do in human resources, but I can see it in how would our colleagues in the International Data Center Division, what would this mean for them? And I know that there's some projects afoot where they look at things like that. So I think there's, a lot to grapple with. And I would hope that our operations 10, 15, 20 years from now look different in some meaningful ways than they do today. So. I hope that's a
Thank you,
useful response.
Dipti. Allow me one last question from my side. As a former IAEA Nuclear Safeguards Inspector, I'm just wondering how do your inspections differ from the IAEA? Because as an IAEA inspector, you go to the field to verify a declaration and nuclear material present, whereas in your case, you would go post a nuclear explosion. So you would find all these radiological signatures, and it may also be a little bit dangerous, I guess, for the inspectors if they are exposed to radiation that they are not aware of.
Right.
So how would that differ, just for my own interest?
Sure. So let me use what I know about inspections from OPCW, where you have inspectors that go to do routine industry inspections, right? And making sure that they're going through their checklist of everything's in order, nothing's being, nothing doesn't make sense about what materials are there or what kinds of facilities are there. And I believe similarly, it's the same thing for IAEA safeguards, right? You're trying to determine that there isn't diversion of nuclear material for weapons purposes, right? That it's remaining in peaceful use. For us, where it is a different, so that's like a routine inspection that happens, of course, unless there's something more serious to be assessed, as has been the case for the agency. And of course, I think even for the agency, you require the inspecting state to agree for those inspectors to come in. And that's been a challenge for the IAEA, both with DPRK and with Iran, in terms of whether there's been government cooperation. For an on-site inspection for CTBTO, it's happening after a state party has raised a concern. It goes through a process that has to be then greenlit by the Executive Council. And that inspected state party has actually a set of responsibilities about what it needs to do, including, by the way, protection of inspectors. And our inspectors also go through training. There's always a health and safety aspect to that, because, of course, they're very mindful that there could be radiation of different types. But they're basically taking this holistic view of where there's been a concern that something has happened and being able to determine kind of the facts on the ground about it. So I feel like that's what's a little bit different. I think for the agency, like, nobody's coming to the agency and saying, hey, I know that this 95% enriched uranium has been put into this device. Go look at it in that facility, right? I mean, I don't think it's happened to that level. So I think that that's part of the difference there, but I also don't want to speak outside of my remit of what the agency does on safeguards. So, but I hope that that explains some of the difference.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
welcome.
So anyway, let me hand back to Olipa. Before I do that, I would just like to express my gratitude to you, Dipti, for this very insightful and interesting and captivating talk. I've learned a lot from you because although I'm based in Vienna and I worked for the agency for many, many years, we still work in these boxes and don't know enough about what each one of us does. So thank you very much for that. And I hope the audience also enjoyed. I could see many questions, so we had very active participation. Thank you very much for that. I would also like to express my gratitude to Olipa for leading this conversation. You've done an excellent job. And last not least, in the background, I would like to thank Agostina and Florencia for leading us through this webinar and doing all the important work in the background. So please, back to you, Olipa.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Dipti, once more. I know our president has already thanked you, but we are so grateful for having taken time off your busy schedule to come and share the few insights with us. We are also grateful to our participants, the new and the old, as always. You've been amazing, and it's been very, very engaging. Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just say, I also want to express my thanks. I so love that this organization exists, that you have brought together so many talented women from all over to engage in these issues. I will tell you from my core portfolio, which is we're always looking for talented women and men, of course, to help us with our mission. Please engage with us. Like if we have things that, yes, we're a technical secretariat, but if we have something that you think might be of interest, please learn more about us and potentially apply, but also just keep being so curious and engaging with your networks and doing things like this so that you understand an issue, that you have the confidence to talk about it. I think that that's really great. So I just want to applaud all of you and thank you so much for your engagement. It was a real honor to be able to talk to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That marks the end of our webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. It was great.
Bye.
Thank you.